Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in Australia today. Very happy to welcome you to this Future Battery Industry CRC webinar today. We'll be starting shortly, so we'll just leave some time for people to come into the room. Thank you. It is my privilege today to introduce the latest piece of work from the Future Battery Industry CRC. We've conducted this in conjunction with CSIRO. And this is a focus on recycling and reuse of lithium-ion batteries. And my pleasure is to introduce Jacques Eckstein, who's our COO at the CRC, and he'll be introducing Anand. I'll just, in terms of housekeeping, we are recording this session and that will be available later. We have heaps of great questions, so if we don't get to your questions today and you want to follow up with me, feel free to email me with the contact details that'll be on the screen at the end of the session. But we will make every attempt to have our experts address your questions. So thank you for attending, and I'll pass over to Anand. To Jacques.
Thanks, Jo. Welcome, everybody. This is an important part of our total delivery from the FBICRC. We're now an organization of about 65 participants that are participating, and we just actually completed a piece of work with Accenture on and where we again identified how important the area of repurposing and recycling really is. However, this is a challenging space. It's complex, and we'll touch upon those complexities in today's presentations. Without discussing too much about the CRC, I would just like to introduce Anand. Anand leads the Electrochemical Energy Storage Technologies research team at CSIRO. This team is developing the next generation batteries, Australian standards for commercial systems, and onshore battery recycling technology. A major part of this electrochemical energy storage technologies focus is in understanding how energy storage can be integrated in the Australian electricity grid and allowing increased penetration of solar PV and allowing increased increased penetration of solar PV generation while maintaining grid stability. This area investigates energy storage technology limitations for the unique Australian environment and geography. Anand has been the lead author of this scene-setting piece of research for us, and dealing with a number of very interesting questions that we thought were national issues that had to be resolved, and we'll deal with some of those questions in the session afterwards. Anand, I would like to hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vijay. So whilst I set up, I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors, Jo, Yan Yan, and Thomas, for all of their hard work in actually getting this set up. So hopefully everyone can see my slides now. I'll just give a very brief overview of the work that we've done and the rationales why, and then we can open it up for questions and the panel discussion. So when we talk about lithium batteries and batteries in general in Australia and around the world, there are two main drivers of the market at the moment. One is in electricity generation. We know globally and within Australia especially, we currently use around 200 terawatt hours per annum of electricity, and that's been stable, as you can see from this slide, for the past decade or so. Now, a lot of our electricity generation comes from fossil fuel assets, and so we have a very high footprint of CO2 emissions. Over the past decade and into the future, the industry is slowly transitioning to renewable generation. When we talk about renewables such as solar and wind, we actually need battery storage and energy storage to make this technology effective. We can see a lot of our existing assets or generation assets are coming to the end of life fairly soon. For example, Yallourn, which was supposed to be scheduled for 2032 shutdown recently, has just announced that they're going to shut down a lot earlier. And we're seeing that as these units are coming offline, the industry is transitioning to more and more renewables. So solar PV is the big ones at the moment. And that means that what's going to happen over the next few decades is we're going to get more and more battery systems being installed into the Australian grid. and also there are certain households as well. The second big driver is, of course, transportation. Now, in 2016, about 11% of our greenhouse gas emissions came from the transport sector itself. To remove this, we need to go to vehicle electrification. And in that context, lithium batteries are the only real choice we have globally. Depending on which prediction you use, over the next few decades, we are going to eventually get to a position where most of our vehicle fleets on the road are going to be lithium battery based. And whilst this is not just an Australian issue, globally, again, whether it's Europe, the US, or the major markets, everyone's got different policies and regulations. But over the next 10 to 20 years, the majority of the world's cars are going to become electrified. So whilst that's fantastic for the sales of battery and greenhouse gas emissions, etc., what this does create is an emerging issue which is about to hit us, which is what do we do with these technologies at the end of life? Now, within Australia, the latest predictions from the Battery Stewardship Council suggest that we only collect about 10% of all the lithium batteries sold in our country. What this translates to is we're losing out on a lot of potential value here, between 600 million to 3 billion per annum based on current recovery technologies. So one of the key areas of this report was really to say, why are we losing this sort of recoverable value? Where's this money going? Why is it not coming back into industry and in the Australian economy? What are the gaps? And clearly, what are the opportunities that the sector can use and exploit to generate more income? So the report is really just around trying to understand the landscape of Australia and a little bit more on the global scale as well. One of the crucial things we've done as well as part of this report was not just to have it as an academic report. We also wanted to get the stakeholders' perspectives involved as well, to try and understand what the sector itself is saying is the key problems and make sure that everyone's on the same sort of page. Putting it all together, we come up with a report that's got over 40 or 50 different opportunity areas which we can exploit as a country. And from that, we've identified some of the key ones which the FBICRC can also sort of exploit and evaluate. So how did we do the report? Well, it was really a two-stage process. The first stage was doing a comprehensive gap analysis of all the literature that's out there, looking at what's happening in Australia and what's happening in the world context. Second one was, as I just mentioned, a stakeholder survey. Now, we didn't just focus our survey on the recycling sector itself. We wanted to expand that through the entirety of the battery value chain, from the material supplier, the importers, the retailers, the recycling industry, obviously, but also the regulatory side, state governments, your EPAs, etc., as well as the academic side, just to make sure that everyone's gaps and challenges are actually on the same page and trying to just align everyone to say, here are the big problems, and put everyone on the same page. And once we put all of that together is how we've come up with all of these opportunities that were stated in the report. So the report, the way it's structured is fairly self-explanatory. We start off with that big picture view. What's the big issue that we're trying to solve? What are the HSE hazards? Why do we need to do this work? Then we had to look at the market trends. And the market trends are essentially a 10 to 15-year gap from what the waste stream is going to look like. So if we understand what's happening with the market today, we can sort of start looking at the predictions of what's going to happen at the waste side. We then move into that sort of the economics. We don't want to have a recycling industry that just subsides on government handouts. We need this industry to be standalone. And the way to make them standalone is for companies to be able to extract value out of the materials. And then finally, we move into, what's existing in our infrastructure, in policies in Australia. What are the gaps in the current technologies? Where can we expand and improve? And then finish off with our stakeholder views and opportunities. In terms of our stakeholder methodology, we had a very comprehensive survey that we developed. So there's about 75 questions, and we actually split that up into the 5 different sectors and sent out targeted questionnaires. And the reason for the targeted questionnaire is really just increase the participation rate. We felt very early on that if we handed over a fairly hefty 20 or 30 page document to stakeholders, most probably wouldn't answer. So we had to cut that down and just make sure we try and get some really good participation rates. So what are some of the key messages that we found from this study? Well, one of the big things that popped out to us, and not from our sort of stakeholder perspectives as well, was we really need to harmonize our policies and regulations across all of the states and territories. Many of our industries operate across multiple jurisdictions, and the fact that they're operating in different jurisdictions, different rules and regulations is quite a hindrance to the industry at the moment. The second big one is, of course, to justify investment into expanding of operations, there's a key threshold volume of batteries that need to be delivered to the recyclers. And the starting point of that is we need to increase our collection at the consumer end. There's no point in setting up for an industry which can handle all these massive predicted volumes of waste tonnages if we can't get it to them from the householder. The next big one was really around the sorting issue of batteries and how to separate them into clean waste streams for processing. And just to give an example of what I'm talking about, here's just some cells that I have in my lab. So this is not a comprehensive view of all the batteries out there. But what we can see, even from this very small sample size, there's a lot of different color sheets, for example. The codes on these cells are not unique to different manufacturers or different chemistry types, and they vary from cell to cell. And it becomes very difficult to sort of separate these out into separate sort of battery streams, like iron-based chemistries or manganese or nickel-based chemistries or cobalt, etc. We've got to remember that when we talk about lithium-ion batteries, there's probably about 14 different chemical varieties that are currently available on the market. Not all of them contain high-value materials like cobalt. So if we can't sort out at the front end, it's going to make it very difficult to do the processing at the tail end. Then there's the issue of around information. Now, when a battery is used in an application, the state of health information is there for the user. However, that information doesn't translate to the recyclers at the end of life. And that's a key issue where, if there's a battery that's been damaged or something like that, the way you handle it in a recycling facility is different to just a normal end-of-life battery. But if the information doesn't translate across through to the end processes, it'll create significant issues. And then finally, the biggest one, of course, is the fire risk. And here's just some examples of battery-related fires. We know there's been a number of incidents in Australian landfill sites and recycling facilities in the past few years. We need to have a solution that makes that industry safe. We cannot operate a recycling industry that continually has fires and jeopardizes its staff's health on a routine basis, nor can these industries survive if they're jeopardizing the people who live around them. And just to give an example of how rapidly these fires propagate, the bottom four image stills from a video. The first slide you can see in the bottom left is from a truck pulling into a disposal facility. The third slide, where you can see the fire, is 11 seconds from the point at which that truck tips out a waste. That's how rapidly these fires will propagate. Now, a battery fire itself is quite nasty, but when you have a mixed processing facility where there's other flammable wastes around, you suddenly take a small fire and turn it into a very, very big issue. And so we do need to sort of figure out solutions to make these batteries safer for the recycling industry. So what are the key opportunity areas? Well, we've sort of split these up into sort of the big picture down to the targeted, here's your industry sector of options. Excuse me. At that big sort of picture level, Australia really has that opportunity to take a leadership role in the international stage. We know that we are a small market for batteries, but we are in the renewables sector, that test bed. Companies come to us and set up renewables technology to show the rest of the world, the big markets, how it can be done. And we should be able to capitalize on what we're doing now in that sector and expand that out into that recycling industry as well. And we can do this through a number of ways. We can either influence existing policy changes that are occurring around the world, or we can look to set up new government schemes at a multi-government level. At that national level, we really need to start looking at the stewardship of batteries. Now, we have the battery stewardship scheme, which has just been set up, But we need to sort of say that's a great starting point, but expand that to include all of the sectors which I don't currently cover, the grid scale batteries, the automotive batteries, etc. Of course, there's a real big opportunity to sort of effectively free the hands of our recycling industry by just looking at sort of saying, how do we unify the policies and transportation across all of different states and territories? This doesn't just affect our recycling industry, this also affects our front-end industries of battery manufacturing and battery import and resale. And then, of course, there's a massive opportunity for trying to get everyone to coordinate in how we respond to fires. A fire in a recycling facility based because of a battery is not just a recycling industry issue. The same lithium fire could happen in a household or a vehicle or in a toy store or wherever. And so putting everyone together and having a unified response to how we deal with this will be helpful, not just to the recycling sector, but to everyone in general. Then, of course, education. We need to have an education campaign to start helping consumers understand where they can drop off batteries and what we can do to make things safe and how they can actually participate in this. Now, of course, we could do that at a state-based level or council-based level, but it's much better if we did this across all of the country. We've seen many examples of where this has been done in the past few years, for example, mobile phones, etc. So our plastic bag bans, etc. So we have track record on how to do this. We just need to expand what we've done successfully previously into the batteries area. Now, since we know that the waste stream is going to grow, it's really a good opportunity at this stage to say, well, are our policies and regulations and guidelines which are existing sufficient for use, or should we start looking at reviewing them and making changes or setting up for emerging problems? Now, we have industry bodies like ABRI, which have guidelines which are already available for public use, but we need to expand their reach and get them out to a much broader area, not just the government, but also to consumers as well. So build on the work that's already been done there. Something that would, of course, help the industry is if we had effectively a federal level strategy for the next 20 to 25 years. This helps the industry plan its operations and how they're going to expand, but it also helps investors de-risk investments by understanding that there is a government level policy which will help them, reduce the risk of the investments that they're going to make. At the industry level, it was really around saying we already are doing a lot of these things. We do have collection facilities, etc. But we need to either improve the number of locations that consumers can drop things off or expand existing schemes to start picking up the lithium batteries as well. I mentioned the battery shooter scheme earlier, which is a voluntary scheme at the moment. And we need to sort of really start getting industry to get involved in that and expanding the number of industry players that are part of that scheme. So targeting, the big battery manufacturers, the automotive sectors, etc., not just the retail industry itself. We should also start thinking about how we can plan to expand our facilities to meet the waste as it starts coming in. A lot of our recycling industries are fairly small SMEs, but they will need to improve and expand to cope with much bigger tonnages of waste when they do finally arrive. Now, that's not something that happens overnight. That takes time and planning. And so industry really should start looking at saying, how can we sort of set up for that? Something that would help the industry do that is a really comprehensive techno-economic and market analysis of the existing industry and the emerging industries. Now, this shouldn't just be an academic exercise in our view. This needs participation from all stakeholders to be really useful. And finally, once we do recover materials, what do we do with them? We shouldn't just be looking to recover materials and sell them offshore. We should be looking at sort of developing better markets to say, who can use materials? For example, things like manganese. We know manganese can be used as fertilizers in the agriculture industry. So how do we transition from what we capture in the battery recycling industry, get it purified and in the format that the agriculture industry can use? Things like graphite, for example, can it be reused in battery manufacturing, or should it go into other industries such as lubricants or inks, etc.? So setting up those value chains in that broader ecosystem. In the research area, it was really around saying, yes, we've got a lot of researchers at the moment who are focused on next generation materials recovery, but the here and now problem seems to be not just in Australia, but around the world, the fire safety. This is something that should have solutions which were implemented 10, 15 years ago, but we don't have the solutions yet. So we need to really focus our efforts on that area and say, how can we help the industry and get those solutions out there in a very, very short time frame? And then, of course, academia and the researchers have a really good role to play in developing new markets. So we know we can recover materials. We know the next generation recycling technology that people are working on will recover better materials than other materials which aren't captured currently. But what do we do with them? How do we develop them from just a recovered material that sits in a stockpile someplace to something that's going to be used by somebody? And one of the drivers here is, of course, globally, battery manufacturers are moving away from cobalt. So the current industry, which has really been focused historically on cobalt recovery because that's a high value material, is going to struggle in the next decade to 2 decades as the cobalt value drops down. And just to give an example, in the nickel manganese cobalt battery, the world's sort of transitioning towards the 811 chemistry variant. Now that's actually reducing the cobalt in a 18650 cell to about 6%. Currently it sits around 40%. So that's a massive loss of revenue for anyone who's just focused on cobalt recovery. So what do we do? When you look at battery prices, for example, lithium-ion phosphate battery and a nickel manganese cobalt battery, they're not that dissimilar in price. So there is an inherent value inside the materials in these batteries. We're just not capturing that yet. So we've got to start thinking about saying, how do we capture that and how do we do the next step? After we've captured these materials, what can we do with them? Okay. And I'll finish on there and I'll hand back to Joe. Happy to take questions. Thank you.
Anand, for such a precise and comprehensive coverage of 100 pages of report. Well done, thank you. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our panel members. So we are lucky enough to have Libby Chaplin, who's CEO of the Battery Stewardship Council and recently CEO of the Australian Battery Recycling Initiative, to which Anand referred. So she's used to providing leadership, very in tune with circular economy thinking, and through her own consultancy has worked with lots of e-recycling, across the world, US, Canada, and South Korea, but certainly committed to facilitating sustainable change and is good at synthesizing diverse perspectives. I think that's code for herding cats. And I can imagine that she's going to need some of those skills in her role with the Battery Stewardship Council. So thank you, Libby, for joining us today. And our final panel member is Andrew McKenzie, who is, of course, the Managing Director of Envirostream, our own battery processing facility here in Australia. So they take lithium, alkaline and nickel-based batteries. They've spent years prototyping and developing equipment to get batteries to black matter. And we'll have an opportunity to quiz Andrew on how we could go even further here in Australia. He's also concerned with the downstream side of ensuring best practice and safety and those types of things, and also very committed to circular economy thinking. So we're very privileged to have these two people join our panel. I will also thank you all for your great questions that you've submitted. We're going to try and get through as many as possible, but as I said earlier, if we can't get to them all, my contact details are on the last slide we put up today, and you'll be able to find us. And I know where the panel members live, so if I need help with the questions, I'll get them to that too. Jenny is going to put a poll up for us. Just thought that would be a bit of fun to give you something to interact with. Sorry, I'm back on campus and we are under the flight path to Royal Melbourne Hospital, and the ambulance helicopter always goes over at the most inopportune time. So I apologise for the background noise. But I can see the poll up there. We'd encourage you all to get in and make your votes. Once we've got about 45, we'll close and you can see what the responses are. Okay, I'm going to start with a question for Andrew. So, and sorry, the format of this is I'm going to direct the questions to one person, but if there's somebody who's desperate to have a say, I'm not in any way holding you out of the conversation. You chime in as well. But Andrew, would you lead us on? What percentage of lithium is recoverable from lithium-ion batteries, and what other materials can be harvested during the recycling process?
Thanks, Joe. So you mentioned that we make a black mass, but the black mass is actually the cathode powder and anode powder from batteries. So in the cathode powder, we recover all the lithium, which is of that cathode and anode powder mix is about only 3%. So the other issue is the electrolytes. Currently, we're still developing a technology to recycle the electrolytes. Lab scale tests are very good. We've had that product go to our sister company in VSPC, and they've been able to reuse that as a lithium phosphate precursor for their button cell batteries, which they don't make, as a commercial product, but they make the cathode powder. So that testing has worked very well. So while it's still being developed in this lab scale, we're able to capture the lithium from the cathode powder and also the lithium from the electrolyte salts with our current capabilities.
Thank you. Anybody else feel the need to chime in there?
Yes, I can sort of add into that. So as Andrew said, the electrolyte lithium is not actually captured at the moment. So typically in hydromet processing, it will end up as some form of lithium sludge, which may or may not get captured depending on the processes. But there's actually a lot of value that just losing out on here. So when you talk about lithium capture from the black mass, typically that sits around $100 to $150 per ton of recoverable value. If you can capture the lithium electrolyte itself and keep it as, say, the lithium PF6, which is found in about 98% of lithium batteries, you're suddenly sitting around $2,000 to $3,000 per ton recoverable value. So there is a lot of work still left to be done, and it's a great thing to see that Andrew started work on this.
Yeah, we have, and the issue is the degrading of battery chemistries as well, and this is the other challenge. So you mentioned all the mixture of lithium battery types. The other thing is what happens to them during their life. So this is another complication for recycling. We don't like to hear they're removing cobalt, but anyway, we'll live with it.
With one little eye on the poll and how heavily Technologies is polling, well, I guess it's only a 3% margin, but we'll take that. I'll direct one to Libby to start with anyway. Libby, which countries can Australia look to for best practice in lithium-ion battery recycling?
Yeah, well, I think probably the leading countries are based in Europe, and if we look at countries like Switzerland and Belgium, they are both collecting upwards of 70% of their batteries for recycling, which compared to Australia's 10% is significantly more. So I think there's a lot to learn from Europe, but Canada and the US also have some good programs in place.
I might just chime in if that's okay. So where we found a lot of good data too is right next door to the battery manufacturing. So there's a lot of difference between a recycled battery and batteries that fail in the production line, but the process, once you get past that collection and the mixture of batteries and some of the electrolyte extraction, when you're dealing with foils and cathode extraction off those foils. So that's why we went and found a lot of good products in South Korea, and in China we're seeing a lot of good technology development, especially around that LFP market. So there's some good. So whereas I'm skeptical of Belgium because of Umicore's pyrolysis process. I think there's a lot of waste there. I think definitely the hydromet plant that Anand and the team are looking at, that type of technology is much better in its recovery and the value rather than burning things.
Yeah, I think that probably my experience is more around the other end of the spectrum, around collection and so forth, and that's where Switzerland and Belgium really are at the forefront. Yeah.
And this has, of course, been one of the challenges of doing this work. We're looking at everything from collection, trying to keep lithium-ion batteries out of landfill and recognise the resource value, right through to what we can extract, markets for recovered materials, and also the market potential for reusing, say, EV batteries that are no longer suitable for an EV, but they still have a lot of capacity left and could be used for stationary power. So maybe I'll move to one of those kind of questions about the other end of the process. And Anand, one of the questions we got was, is it better to fully recycle a battery pack when its capability drops, or to repurpose it for storage infrastructure until it degrades completely? Just a simple answer.
Simple answer is absolutely. There is still a lot of usable life in a different application for those degraded batteries. And if we can sort of repurpose them for another application, it does one or two things. It gets the maximum value out of that battery. But secondly, also delays that battery entering the waste stream. And also, by removing more energy out of this battery because you've degraded it further, you actually start making it a little less likely around fire issues as well at the end of life. So reusing it absolutely has so many advantages.
I think I would just add to that there's still more work to be done to ensure that we understand how that's done safely. Through ABRI, we get a lot of requests from small operators saying, yeah, I've got this idea to repurpose batteries, and it's really important that that's done to really rigorous safety standards to make sure that we're not endangering that worker, but also the end user of that product.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to follow up on that, one of the things we've actually talked about in the reuse and repurposing sector in the report is this is not just a straightforward thing. This is a new industry which is effectively going to be set up. And alongside that will come things like new regulations, standards, etc., quality control. All of these things have to be set up from scratch.
Yep. And maybe just, you wanted a simple answer to a not so simple question. Sorry, Joe. The other thing is the brands and ownership of the battery. So if you really want to do that, we need the brands that have understanding of the battery management and the battery, how it's being used, to then hopefully be able to repurpose that. But if the battery ownership transfers to just the general public, it's very difficult. So there's some big discussions in that space for sure.
Yeah, and we've already seen some EV companies pulling their recycler right next to them, right, and integrating it in their business. So there are certainly some different business models in that space. But we have got also some startups in Australia like Electrify, who are doing some interesting work in that space. And I was being totally facetious when I said an easy answer. We've done a few projects here at the university in this space, and there's nothing easy about it. But staying on that safety theme, and I think you'll all want to have a say on this one, but I'll start with Anand. How do we make end-of-life batteries safe at source? For example, the collection point, before there's enough batteries to become a fire hazard? Okay,
so that is a very difficult question to answer. So the only way to make the battery safe is to remove the risk. Now, the risk here is the fact that there's still stored energy inside these cells, even at end of life. If we can remove the energy, then all of for suddenly you're just going to end up with a lump of effectively inert materials inside a steel or aluminium can or a pouch. The question is, how do we remove that energy? There are so many different varieties. For example, you got your relating 650s and things like that, which come out of power tools, etc. You've got your big packs. You've got your embedded batteries, which are, buried inside mobile phones or laptops, etc. So the solution there isn't straightforward, and I can't actually answer that one. I think that's where the research needs to go to say, how do we actually do this and keep it safe at source? And when we say source, who do we mean? Do we mean the oldies and the recycling facilities there? Do we talk about the automotive manufacturers who will pull the batteries out of vehicles? Do we talk about the laptop manufacturers who will have the returns from the corporate side that they're going to take the batteries out? So what is the source? There's multiple solutions that are going to be needed to make this battery safe.
Is anyone else going to touch that one?
Yeah, I'll give it a go. So just on that, Anand's spot on. The issue is, how do you do that? And there's multiple ways to try and discharge that energy, but the reality is, until you get it to a point where there's enough volume, it's really difficult. So if you've got an Officeworks drop-off container and you're collecting from there's a lot of alkaline batteries, there's a lot of inert batteries, but there's a lot of button cell batteries, which are the ones that are getting into the other batteries and shorting out the terminals and those sort of things. So it's difficult to educate the general public at that point. So you have to build a system that can handle the risk. I think that's the first step in the solution, and that's how we're doing a lot of work and research in that space. You've got to get the right type of container that can look at the risks that you have and deal with it. I think that's one. Then moving it to the second, or an aggregation point where you can start to have some skill to deal with those issues. Because there's a lot of talk about just putting batteries in water and doing that, but you've got some really nasty chemicals, you've got a really nasty mix of batteries, so you can't encourage that activity, or we're going to have waste water problems and things like that. So there's a second and third and fourth part to it, but the very, very first part is how do we collect them knowing there's a risk? Because you can't get everyone to discharge as they drop off that battery. So that battery is going into a collection unit. That collection unit needs to consider there is a risk there. So I think it's quite, if we look at it, and then how big that volume of batteries is allowed to be in that very first step will then affect how the risk is passed to the transport company. And then once that transport company puts it at a storage facility, the risk there hopefully is all taken care of in that very, very first container that it moves with, and you just keep it there until you're skilled enough to deal with it. That's how we see it sort of playing out. Of course, it needs to be looked at, but yeah, that's what we're working on.
Yes, I would agree completely. And I think it does differ entirely depending on what type of batteries we're talking about. So that applies perfectly for the smaller batteries. I think there's still more work to do around the Battery Stewardship Council's current focus is on those batteries, but we've also flagged that our scope includes all batteries, including energy storage and electric vehicle. But there is more work to do around understanding the collection channels. And I think Andrew's comment that it really should be risk-based is really relevant no matter which area we're looking at. How are we getting the batteries from that first point to the aggregation point? And those risks will vary depending on the type of battery. Doesn't really matter which of those two it is over the next 9 months and beyond. The Battery Stewardship Council is going to be looking very closely at this to develop guidance so that the collection process is set up in such a way that it does exactly what Andrew just indicated, which is we need to be able to manage the risk at source.
There's actually a live question that is, I think, relevant to this discussion. Can an inert recyclable gel be used as a collection medium?
Of course, theoretically, yes, I would say. But when you're looking at the scale of what we're aiming to do, last year, the research that came out of the Battery Stewardship Council conducted by EnvisageWorks identified 800 million equivalent battery units, which is small, equivalent to a small battery being sold into the country every year. So if we're really proposing to put them into a gel, that's, you know, it's a very large amount of gel that would be required, and how you would then manage that, you know, additional hazardous waste, I would expect, would be a significant and costly activity.
And the issue, while there's a risk, the added complication of you know, mixtures in the waste stream is already bad enough. There's alkaline, there's nickel metal hydro, there's 14 different lithium batteries. It just is a monstrous task to sort all these batteries into their chemistry, because the chemistry is so important to the next step. So you can't build a hydromet process to just drop everything in. And if you could, you don't want to have a gel added to that. So this is where it's really difficult. So great idea. Hard to put into practice, I think, because the sorting would become very difficult. So we have to manually sort these batteries into chemistries. Yeah, so there's some very simple ways to look at collection. If we're just covering that off a little bit quickly, where you know the risk. It's looking like a fire, or it's looking like a heat hazard. So why not build thermal containers for that product? You know, that then can be tested to a current dangerous goods standard without, yeah.
And the other risk, of course, that we haven't mentioned is that the batteries are heavy. So keeping them in small containers is another good way of minimising the risk. Yeah.
100 cubic centimetre box, or millimetre box, sorry, can hold 5 kilos of batteries. That's how heavy they are.
And then when you start talking about the bigger batteries, the weight obviously increases. So you take something like a Tesla Powerwall, that's 80 to 90 kilos.
Yeah.
That's a single unit.
Yes. Yeah, the mass is as good as the energy density, right?
Yeah.
Well, and the risk associated with a charged one that hasn't been discharged is really significant. And, you know, I think there's a whole, it's fine when those batteries are just going back through the manufacturer, but if there's been an accident, where are they going? Are they going to go to a scrapyard that doesn't necessarily understand the risks or have the expertise or the technology necessary to manage that charge and fire risk?
Exactly.
Okay. Lots of ground there to cover, and we might come back to public awareness, because that has polled quite highly too. But I just want to, there's another live question, and that one's about commercial value, but I might start with one to Libby. What is the approximate total volume and consistence, as in, I think they're talking about chemistry types, of the batteries to be recycled in Australia and New Zealand per year?
So it is, I think I just had that up actually. So it depends on, so if we look at handheld batteries, it's about, let's just see, about 22,000 tonnes being sold, and so probably a little less than that being available for recycling. If we add on top of that electric vehicle and energy storage, it's about another 6,500, but that's obviously going to exponentially increase over the coming years. And then if we look at lead acid, which is not really the topic of today's discussion, but there's about 153,000 tonnes there. But fortunately, because of the value of the lead, the majority of that is already being recycled, and in fact providing a great example of a circular economy, because much of that lead goes back into manufacturing automotive batteries again.
Yeah, there's certainly some distinction from lead acid, but it's still a good example of what good looks like, isn't it? So the live question was, what is the current commercial potential of LIBS recycling, and is it a good career start for an early stage researcher?
Might take this one.
Yeah.
It's terrible, don't get involved.
But we want you to research it.
Yeah, research it. We might be able to use something you learn. No. Look, it's really, when you talk about cobalt and you look at it 2 years ago, $90,000 a tonne, everyone gets super excited. The issue is when the market with potential cobalt is that 6,000 tons of EV and energy storage. Now, not all of that is nice LCO batteries. They're in mobile phones. And the mobile phone, if you look at it as its own industry, is only a very small percentage of the battery market. There's also a high value in a mobile phone that's a second-hand unit, so they get a lot of them get exported. So actually, the tough part of the industry is collection. They're really securing this waste stream, making sure it doesn't get exported. So there's an opportunity here, one for a business to set up to recycle, but the other is for research. If we've got the products here, we're hearing it now in plastics and glass and all those things. The rest of the world don't want it anymore because it's difficult to deal with your own. But now we go, let them have their easy stuff. It's crazy. We're just letting that opportunity go. We're talking about adding value to the mining industry, but we could add a lot of value if we research it properly, if we really get on, one, to education, but the other is the recycling industry. There's the same commodity, but in a much purer form than what they're mining at the other end. And that'll be the trick to the LFP. If we can get that market, we can learn how to recycle it. If we can really understand how to get that value, that product to a value to be reused, either in batteries or something else, that's where the future is, because they're not going to be cobalt heavy for very long.
And so I can add in on to that as well and say, so you've just talked about one of the current 14. There's, what do we do with the other 13? And what do we do with all the batteries that are at the lab scale, which are about to hit the market now? The silicons, the lithium metals, etc. We have no solutions for the emerging market, so the emerging battery technologies, which are being developed now. And so obviously there's a lot of work left to do.
I mean, it's a challenge for us. Australia is such a small market, but I think product stewardship really is central to this on an international scale. Obviously, we can use product stewardship to improve recycling and recovery here, but until companies are designing in the recovery process, like really considering that as they design the products, both in terms of, throughout the whole process, so it's collection, sorting and recycling, it's going to be difficult. So I think there's a big opportunity internationally to change the conversation around, product stewardship in this space. And I think just adding on to what Andrew said, the other issue is that, it's a lost opportunity, not just in relation to what he was mentioning, but also the World Bank put out a report last year which indicated that if we don't change the way we're managing these resources, we will have used them all up by 2050, which is really not that far away. So both in terms of energy security, resource security, there's some real drivers, I think, for getting involved in research in this space.
Yeah, I totally. And I mean, even the kind of the base levels of lithium forecasting relies on about 20% recycled content. And then I have seen some work coming out with up to 60% coming, from recycled content. But there's so many different ways I could go. But while we're on this, what do you think the single greatest barrier to recognising the raw resource value tied up in end-of-life libs is?
I think it's product stewardship.
Yeah, will you hurry up and get that going?
Yeah, I mean, I agree at the
we know someone in that.
I guess I was meaning true product stewardship. I mean, we're very much focused here in Australia on dealing with the end of the problem, but in reality, it does need to go well up the chain. And so we can encourage that, and we certainly will be. We have it, as part of our member agreement with importers to look at this point. But without product stewardship, we're definitely going to struggle to make this work.
Yeah, but I think to back that up, you need a couple of things from government. And one is the leadership to get the brands to pay for a stewardship. They need, unfortunately, they really need a threat of regulation or a tariff or however you want to call it otherwise, to participate in stewardship. It's such a consumer-driven market that unless we get the government to change the brands and the companies, a lot of these brands exist in Hong Kong and Singapore, and they don't actually do the importing themselves. So this is really a tricky way to get out of paying these levies and make the retailers import the batteries. So this is another problem with stewardship, is you need the government leadership there to say, doesn't matter, it's your brand, it's your product, you're responsible and you've got to pay.
Yeah, I agree.
That's the start. And then I think even if, then a voluntary system can work very well, because there'll be enough to help obviously the recycling and everything, but there's also enough then to follow up the enforcement. How do you avoid not just the libs, right? If we're talking the lower value lib batteries, they're going to go to landfill and everyone just wants the cobalt battery. How are you going to deal with alkaline batteries? Because they're not very attractive either. We talk manganese to fertilizer. Manganese is super cheap. Fertilizer is super cheap. So how do you make a recycling industry out of that? But you can do it. You can learn, the research there is some really good skills to learn and to be educated on how to, run a hydromet plant, how to really extract manganese oxide and get it into a plant-based fertilizer. That really got some good uptake results. We've been working on that, but the value is not there.
Mm.
Yeah, and
maybe
then
thinking outside the box of other extraction methods that we haven't even thought about yet would be interesting.
Absolutely. And from my perspective, it's absolutely, after we've got the stewardship set up, we need to also make sure that we're designing and building batteries to be recycled.
Mm.
Like, we've opened up systems in our laboratories where you need an angle grinder just to get to the cells. Now, you can't do that on an industrial scale with something which is generating sparks next to something that's flammable.
Yeah.
However, that problem can very easily be solved by using nuts and bolts instead of welding. And so, manufacturers should start also thinking, saying, how do we get recyclers to get access to the materials in a very easy fashion?
Mm.
That would be true circular economy thinking, right? That you're thinking for the end of life. And I note there's also a question there about, would labelling, would some kind of standardisation on labelling help with the sorting and help with the public awareness of what to do with batteries? Well, it, probably would, and it would certainly help with automation if you had more standards in that space, right?
And there certainly are standards like those emerging. Japan has a standard that's a colour-coded approach. The difficulty is it's an international world, and so getting agreement that will actually be used by the manufacturers is what's difficult there. We need a global circular economy department.
And that's where, we said Australia can take that leadership role.
Yeah.
But that sort of coordination just isn't there at the moment. So
yeah, and that's where our federal government can step in and lead that coordination. We can't enforce it, being a very small market in the world, but we are a very powerful market. And so we can help the world stand up and say, look, the problem is everyone's got the same issue. It's not just Australian sorters have the issue. It's globally, everyone's got that issue. So I think, there's a massive opportunity there for us to lead the way.
Yeah, I think so. If you look at button battery standards, everybody's been saying the same thing there for ages. But the ACCC has just released 4 new button battery standards that are really unique in the world. And I think that they will influence globally because people will be looking to those new guidelines and standards to change. So, it isn't impossible to change from here, but it is a challenge that has to be, harnessed.
Just put one point in for the labelling. I was waiting for Libby because I know that it was close to her heart, but tracking things like tracking the resources is another reason to look at labelling. I know that that's circular economy, but really, if we want to look at how to track nickel through the process and how to track these resources, labelling can be the key to more than just helping us sort batteries into the right chemistry, right? It really helps work out if it's ethically sourced, how much you were talking earlier, Joe, about to 20%, is it going to be 60% of recycled content? There was a brand that put 5% recycled content in its batteries, but it stopped because it was too expensive. People wouldn't buy it. It wasn't successful, so they just went back to doing it the old way.
But that brings in another point in that having good procurement policies that government is a big user of batteries as well, so they could certainly make a difference in putting those sort of positive policies in place.
So we only have a few minutes left. Just to close out, could you each comment on what needs to happen to enable a vibrant battery recycling industry in Australia?
Andrew, do you want to go first this time?
As you asked that, the results of the poll came up, so I was looking straight at the screen. I think, do I give out the results without giving it away of the tracking? But look, I think public awareness is very important. But again, that will never. The awareness needs to be where to take your batteries. So I think the convenient collection ultimately becomes number one. That's when you get to the recycling stage. But without the government leadership and without the stewardship to really ensure there's some security for investment, I think that's the hardest part. So that government leadership will drive investment. The stewardship will return on that investment, if you like, in a shorter term than trying to make a plant that can get to the 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 tonnes that are needed before you can really get enough commodity to pay the bills for all this equipment. So that's probably the first step, and then the convenient collection, public awareness comes second and third. And I'll stop for a second.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, the battery stewardship scheme was authorised only fairly recently, and it's really only been the last few weeks that we've started moving from a concept design to actually rolling out the scheme. The intent is for that to begin in January of 2022. So that's only 9 months away. So during that time, we've got branding to develop, container protocols, safe aggregation guidelines, getting that tracking application in place so that we can make sure that the batteries are actually being recycled at the end of their life. So it's an exciting time to be in this space, because finally, after talking for a really long time, we're moving into action. I think probably the most important thing for everybody at the moment is to get on board with what the Battery Stewardship Council is doing and help us to design a robust scheme that can last into the future and be self-sustaining.
Thank you, Libby. Anand,
so I'll take
final word.
I absolutely agree with everything that Libby and Andrew said, but I'll also add on the fire safety here. Collection is very, very important, but if we can't collect in a safe manner, we're going to hurt people. Very rapidly, you'll see the entire industry just shut down through over-regulation. So we need to have solutions to make sure that collection is safe for people.
Yes, agree 100% there, Anand.
So at this point, on behalf of all the participants, I would like to thank our panel members for a lively and engaging discussion. Thank you, Libby. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, Anand, for also presenting the report findings. This is really just the beginning of a conversation. The Future Battery Industry, CRC, is looking at the research opportunities, and with some identification of the time available and the dollars available where we can have the greatest impact for our research activity. So it's very much the start of a conversation, not the end of a conversation. And of course, CSIRO has a very big body of activity in batteries in general, or energy storage in general. And you've already just heard battery stewardship's getting up and running under Libby's leadership, and Envirostream is continually improving and looking for the business opportunities there. So thank you all. Thank you, participants, for attending, and good day.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, everyone.
Appreciate it.
Cheers.